After 5 years of the Ja Morant, Desmond Bane, and Jaren Jackson Jr. trio, right as the three are entering the core, the trio has been broken up. After only one playoff series win and an era headlined by promise, and then controversy and injury concerns, ultimately it ends in relative disappointment, especially over the last 2 seasons. That leads us to the massive change of Bane being traded for 4 first-round picks alongside KCP and Cole Anthony, massively changing the current roster and making everyone question the future of the Grizzlies. Whether this is a move being made to retool and avoid terrible apron and tax implications, or whether this is the start of a further rebuild in Memphis, although reports at the time of recording are indicating that that's not likely. Let's get into why the Memphis Grizzlies made this trade, how it hurt them in the short term, but what options they now have to improve their roster in the future. Now, one of the big reasons one could look at making this trade is the financial implications. It's the boring part, but under the new CBA, very much a real part. The Grizzlies would have entered next season under the tax threshold, however, it's very unlikely that would have lasted for much longer. Jaren Jackson Jr. is extension eligible this summer, and alongside a renegotiation of his 2025-26 salary that would be most likely under this extension, he would be set to earn $223.9 million over the next 5 seasons, which alongside the 3 years remaining on Ja Morant's contract would have brought the Grizzlies near the tax if you consider what would have been Desmond Bane's contract still on the roster. Now sure, the Grizzlies still had to take back nearly the entirety of Bane's contract in other salaries for the current season, but Cole Anthony only has 1 more season guaranteed, and KCP only has 2 when compared to the 4 on Desmond Bane's contract. We also must consider that going into next season, the salary of KCP and Cole Anthony will remain the same as they continue down into year 2 into the future of their contract, while Desmond Bane continues to increase towards and eventually over $40 million a season. As things stand going into next season, without Desmond Bane on the roster, and free a potential Jaren Jackson Jr. extension and renegotiation of his 2025-26 salary, the Grizzlies' projected salary is $150 million per NBA financial expert Bobby Marks, which makes them slightly below the cap of $154.7 million and well below the tax threshold of $187.8 million. Outside of what would have been their core 3, Memphis are also fortunate enough to not really be paying their role players at all right now in terms of any significant money. The only ones they're paying significant money are the 2 they just got back to match salaries with Desmond Bane. That being said, I'd imagine this trade involves some foresight into how their financial future could be impacted with retaining the core 3 once time comes to extend Scottie Pippen Jr., Zach Edey, and Jalen Wells within a few seasons. There's also other benefits of this trade outside of avoiding the luxury tax and tax aprons, but we'll get into that soon. In the short term, is there cause for concern? Certainly. I mean, you're losing 20 to 23 points a night and the solid defense of Desmond Bane, so that's not nothing to sniff at. It's going to be noticed on the court, and considering how well he's filled in at times as the primary option and creator in absence of Ja Morant, his departure will certainly be missed. You can't question that. However, I don't believe the Grizzlies will completely fall off a cliff with his departure and out of playoff relevance even in the short term. Thankfully, the 2 players they received in return for Bane will help to fill some of the void left by Bane's departure in the short term. Although certainly not near the impact of Desmond Bane, Kentavious Caldwell-Pope can immediately fill into the starting shooting guard role and offer great defensive upside alongside Jalen Wells, letting Ja Morant hide against the opposition's worst offensive guard as is ideal. Now, the hope is that if you're Memphis, you really hope KCP regains his 3-point shot that seemingly evaporated last year in Orlando. Additionally, you get Cole Anthony as a potential microwave scorer and for some more creation off the bench. It's also someone who could fill in and eat up some more minutes in the case that Ja Morant inevitably does eventually miss some games. But the inconsistencies of Cole Anthony can become too much of an issue at times, and if that is the case, then you can be out of his contract in a year and just continue to rely on the superior production and development of Scottie Pippen Jr., whose recent improvements will likely fill a significant part of the void felt by the departure of Desmond Bane. They'll certainly be worse in the short term. Undeniably so. You can't lose a borderline all-star and not get worse from the trade. But they're well positioned to remain competitive nonetheless. So let's get into the positives and the main reasons Memphis would make this trade outside of the fun, boring financial implications. A big part of that is the flexibility of these draft picks. 4 draft picks plus a pick swap is what the Grizzlies get in this trade, including a first-round pick in 2025, a draft the Grizzlies only had picks 56 in going into this trade, which will allow them to potentially add another solid rotational piece as they got pick 16. Now, the most important part of this trade is the long-term flexibility. Ultimately, these picks aren't that valuable in terms of being likely high firsts that are going to yield you great talents unless they really hit at the back end of the first round. Outside of the 2026 Suns first round pick, which Lord knows what the Suns are going to be like next year, but it's possible that that falls in the lottery. Outside of that, the Magic's picks in 2028 and 2030 are likely to be anywhere from the early to late 20s. They're not going to be amazing picks. But what it does do is give them great flexibility on the trade front. Considering where the Grizzlies have been at in terms of first-round picks the last few years after trading away a couple of first-round picks to acquire Marcus Smart, and then again attaching their 2025 first-round pick with Smart to just get rid of his salary to Washington at the deadline, the Grizzlies have gone from being in a first-round pick deficit over the last few years to now having a massive surplus. Now, moving forward, they have an absolute abundance of first-round selections, which, sure, they could use to springboard a rebuild, which could exist over the coming years if certain conditions were met. But I would imagine in an ideal world, they could be used to acquire another star or multiple high-level starters in Memphis via trade over the next couple of seasons. The amount of future trade flexibility the Grizzlies now have is ridiculous, with 3 movable first-round picks that aren't even their own straight from the Desmond Bane trade, and that gives them ample ability to make an intriguing package using their picks to acquire a future star in the future without completely ruining their future trade flexibility and using all of their own tradable picks, which allows for further improvements of the roster and the addition of other role players and high-level starters alongside what is now the core 2. That being said, there is a world where this functionality of their draft picks becomes irrelevant and the Grizzlies move in another direction. There's one glaring concern about going forward with a duo of Ja and Triple J. Availability. Now, in all fairness to Jaren Jackson Jr., he's significantly improved his availability since his first 3 seasons in the league, having played over 60 games in all of the last 4 seasons and playing 74 last year. With Morant, that becomes a bigger concern as he's only played over 60 games once in the last 4 years and only hit 50 this past season. If both are on the floor surrounded by an improving group of solid role players, this could be a competitive roster. Now, not one that you're threatening to make deep playoff runs with, but one that could certainly flirt with the playoffs. However, that if of availability is a very big if with this duo, especially on the part of Morant. If availability and health remains an issue for this core 2, they're not going to be competitive for a playoff spot, as we saw already only a couple of years ago, and this is where we could see the Grizzlies' future start to disintegrate and could ensue complete rebuild. At this point, the Desmond Bane return becomes much more about utilizing those picks for drafting future rotational pieces and potentially moving off of KCP and even Cole Anthony for additional future assets, again, if these conditions are met and the rebuild is the direction they go with. Ultimately, I think this is a good value trade for Memphis, but the concern is that none of those first-round picks are likely to be in the lottery, barring potentially the 2026 Suns selection, and the direction of the roster is still very much in question. What they actually get out of this trade in the long run is far from being determined and will very much more determine how good of a trade this actually is for Memphis. If they rebuild and hit on some picks, great. If they try to remain competitive and move them on for a star, awesome. If they don't draft well or they sit on them and don't really get much out of it, you traded away Desmond Bane for some late firsts that don't materialize. There's more to be done here in the next 12 to 18 months, hence the evaluation on Memphis' side of this trade is still very much going to be taking a while as some of these picks materialize and they make more trades. But whether it's a full-scale rebuild or a trade happens involving these picks, this is just the start of different times in Memphis, and they are going to be very active over the next couple of years.